Thank you very much, Eleanor. Some of you will know me as the ex-Chief Executive of Skill in the UK, and some of you will get to know me as the editor of the Ahead Journal. So if you see me coming, you might want to run. I'll be after an article. And I'm also the evaluator on the UDL Erasmus project, which Norway are leading, which includes Belgium, Flanders and Ireland. So I have lots of hats. But today I'm going to talk about some research I did with a colleague last year for the Equality Challenge Unit in the UK. The Equality Challenge Unit is a higher education cross-funded government and institutions, higher education institutions themselves, unit looking at all the protected characteristics under our new equality law, but obviously originally was looking at race, gender and disability. And we were asked to do some research onto the application of competence standards in courses inside universities. We understood that this was driven partly from disability coordinators being very concerned that students were reaching quite a long way on their course before they found that their tutors regarded them as not being able to meet some of the insurmountable competence standards on the course. Sometimes these were professional standards, but sometimes these were requirements of the course that their impairment was regarded as not being able to be reasonably accommodated in order for them to succeed. So the brief that we were given was to find out how institutions identify the core competencies for a course, how institutions assess competencies for a course, and how prospective and current students are informed of competencies, assessment methods, and reasonable accommodations. So I'm starting really from another direction, if you like. I'm looking at the legal view for disabled students. So this is about disabled students, but of course, like all UDL activities, it applies to everyone. But we set up the research, which took around 6 to 9 months, obviously with a literature review, and there is a lot of literature because you've all been talking about it. And we also agreed to look at 4 particular academic areas: teaching and nursing, because they have external professional competence standards as well as internal ones; French and Spanish, because there are issues around assessment and trips abroad, things like that; GEES, which actually stands, if I can get it right, geography, in environmental science, and something else beginning with E that I can't remember. It always catches me out. But it's a whole academic group. It's a science subject, and again that's about access to laboratories, fieldwork, other things. So these areas were chosen because they were regarded as areas where there's challenge for lecturers in terms of delivering the course, and helping students meet the competencies. And we did face-to-face group interviews for nursing and teaching because it's a complex area and it covered the whole of the United Kingdom. And we learnt an awful lot. We did individual telephone interviews, and we met with the national bodies, particularly the Quality Assurance Agency. I am of the view that this universal design and inclusive teaching and learning, or inclusive learning, however you want to call it, is a quality issue. It's all about mainstream business of the university. So the disability bit is not something on the side. I think Pia said, they sent them to me. They're my students. They're not my students. They're your students, Mr. Academic, Mrs. Academic. And the Quality Assurance Agency in the UK lays down all sorts of levels of things that universities have to do. And we did an interview the academics in modern languages and GEES, and they gave us some very interesting information. The first thing that we discovered in talking to the university staff, there's actually an awful lot of words around which are sometimes misunderstood, particularly by students, I have to say, and we were quasi-students because we were coming in a different direction. We have the phrase competence standards, which is laid down in our equality law, and there is a definition for it, which I will give you, but you won't need to know that because you'll have your own laws. So there is the Disability Discrimination and Equality Law requirements on universities. Then there are academic standards. Then there are course requirements. And then there are course competencies. And all these phrases are juggled around in student handbooks and in information and are causing disability coordinators particularly a lot of problems in being told we can't provide a reasonable adjustment because the course requirement is this. But is the course requirement the legal requirement, or is it the requirement the course team have set up? And the key is, if it's a legal requirement and it meets the standard, the issue is what can and can't receive a reasonable accommodation. So we're looking at that line. A course requirement might be, but we'll discuss that. So we have this legal requirement of an academic, medical or other standard applied on or behalf of an education provider, the university, or a qualifications body, which would include the professional bodies, to determine whether or not a person has a particular level of competence or ability. It applies to all students, and it has to be objectively justifiable and proportionate and generally relevant to the particular course. And this has been the key to the discussion that we might be hopefully going to have. If it meets all those requirements, you cannot make a reasonable accommodation to it, because that is the bar, that's the level every student must demonstrate they've met. But you can make many accommodations as to the route the student takes to demonstrate that competence. And we've seen lots of very interesting methods of teaching and learning from the previous speakers. So you can use all sorts of methods of a student demonstrating the competence, but they have to demonstrate it. So we started to look at some of this. I won't call it jargon because these are important words, particularly for academics, but all these different topics, trying to sort them out a bit. Academic standards, generally agreed, was that these are about the pass marks you set for your course, the grading and marking scheme that you might have on your course, that differentiates between the levels of student achievement, and you will all have these in your universities. The course requirements might be every student must go on a field trip, or every student must study abroad, every student must undertake a work placement. In the UK, a work placement is more or less a necessary thing for every student to do. But these are unlikely to be legal competence standards unless they're linked to professional registration in some way, like teaching practice, nursing placements. But they're an interesting thing to unpack. And then the course competencies. What do you want the students to show you? Intellectual skills, subject-specific skills and knowledge, generic skills, personal attributes. How do you make these objective? These are all the things that you want to see a well-rounded student develop as you're teaching. And the quality assurance arrangements for your university. There's probably a separate team in the university who's looking after quality assurance. And really, if we're going to move UDL forward, these teams need to start talking to each other, because otherwise you're going to continually run up, but we do quality assurance this way. So we looked at it on the basis of the UK legislation, and this slide is just about what disability discrimination is, and I'm not going to dwell on it because you need only to know what your own country does, but only to say that the two key things for HEIs in the UK are that they must not fail to make reasonable adjustments, reasonable accommodations, if they're appropriate. That would be a discriminatory act. And they have an anticipatory duty under the Act, which is they must always expect to have a diverse group of students and a diverse group of disabled students. So they have to show that they have plans in place for that. So we're not anymore dealing with students on, oh, hello, you've arrived. You can't see. What shall I do now? Basis that we are actually making this anticipatory duty as part of the planning of the university. And by and large, that is happening. It's, the UK has a good record on these things. So then we started to look at the course materials, because this is where you start to dig down into what the course is going to cover. So what are those intended learning outcomes in the study programme that the student is going to have to meet? So and I have another lovely phrase which we'll get to a bit later, about what is the student expected to know at the end of the course and the skills they're going to have. And that may include professional requirements, which cannot be changed. You can't suddenly change the Royal College of Nursing and the Nursing Institute's decision on what a nurse or a midwife must do. But you need to know what all these are, and then you need to know how you're going to assess, what methods of assessment you're going to use, how is the student going to demonstrate that they've achieved these things in the learning outcomes. And that includes what is the outcome of field work or a work placement. And most of these, I would say, would be adjusted by reasonable accommodations. There are very few placements that are going to be professionally required, and there are some, which can't be adjusted. But we'll explore that, and you might tell me I'm wrong. So when we started on this, it was very much Pia's hammer or gavel that she showed on her slide. I think the intention was that we would write guidance that allowed disability officers say to academics, you must do this, put the hammer down, this is what the Act says, no more aggravation, we will work with the students this way. But, of course, once we started on it, we realised this is actually all about an inclusive approach and inclusive design. So we brought this into the guidance that we wrote. I think this wasn't necessarily an anticipated outcome of the research when we were given the contract to do it, but it became completely obvious as soon as we started that this is what it's all about. This is just another aspect that you have to deal with in your universal design approach, because inclusive design enables an embedded approach. So this is where we are making sure that the actual course has embedded this good practice in it, that it ensures an anticipatory response, which the law requires our universities to do. It demonstrates the quality assurance in teaching and learning, so it links with those areas, and it reduces the need to make one-off and regular reasonable adjustments. This is, well, I was going to say this is Chettl's pyramid, but you maybe haven't seen that yet. But this is where we are starting to look at the students with certain kinds of characteristics of disability where a university is making the same adjustment over and over again. And that might be an indicator that maybe there's another way you could deliver the course that would save you all that effort and energy that you're putting into it. That it matches the design of teaching and learning requirements for the full range of students. This is all students, we've said that all along today. And it does require a team approach. If you're going to embed the approach in the inclusive design, it will involve support areas. There is still a very important role for the disability coordinator, but it involves people who perhaps don't naturally work together, working together. The academics in the department, the course writers, the courses in the UK have to have an external who looks at the course. So that's the way the quality of a course is set. It's set within the higher education system, and they need to be working together. And when we went out to start doing our interviews, we were welcomed with open arms in every disability office, because we said, we're going to interview, say, the teaching department in the university, but the disability coordinator must be present. Coordinator must be there. And they went, oh, thank you. We have been trying to get this off the ground and talk to our people. Please come. So we didn't have any trouble getting cooperation in doing the research. But that does mean a requirement of understanding departmental roles may change, and that's all departmental roles. You know, this isn't painless in a way, because people have got used to delivering one way, and we've seen some lovely examples of change, and all those people delivering that change are excited. But there are colleagues who are perhaps less excited, who we need to engage as well. And I'm sure the workshops and things that were demonstrated are a very good way of doing that. So we prepared, following our interviews, a publication. It is a publication called Guidance on competence standards, which is not yet published, which is slightly embarrassing, but that is purely a publication difficulty, and should be out in April on the Equality Challenge Unit website. And we've divided the publication into 4 main sections: drawing up competence standards, assessment processes, information for students, which I want to talk about, and delivering the reasonable accommodations inside the course programme. And we designed the guidance not to be a how-to document, but it's a series of reflective questions that the team that needs to come together, including people who haven't worked together before, need to look at in order to work out their approach on their course design and development. So here are some of the reflective questions that we want people to talk about. This is aimed at the teams inside academics departments who draw up new courses, who review existing courses that are coming up under the quality arrangements that most people have. Courses have to be reviewed and updated. And it will be a helpful list of questions if there are particular courses where students with certain characteristics or impairments there's constantly a question over whether they're meeting the competence standards, which is not related to their ability, but related to their impairment. So, is this a competence standard, or is it some other criterion or policy? So this is the first question. Is this legally a competence standard? Right. Why are we applying this standard? Is it genuinely relevant? So you can't just think up a few standards, because that's what you did when you were at university. They've got to be relevant to the course. You can't exclude a disabled student because it's not genuinely relevant standard, because you could be challenged legally. Have we used language that creates barriers? Can I express requirements in a way that eliminates these barriers? This is often about people using reading and writing rather than communication, laying down that you've got to have a certain skill, which obviously some disabled students don't choose. Who's been involved? Have we had everybody on the right team? And how are we going to evaluate whether these competence standards are actually meeting the requirements, so that we know that other things can be reasonably accommodated for students as they come by? The second one is assessment. What are the competence standards we need to assess? So once we know what those are, we can look at the approach. Is the approach inclusive? Are the reasonable adjustments mostly embedded in our assessments? Will it mop up a lot of those students who we've been giving extra time in exams to different kinds of invigilation or scribes? Who's been involved in developing the assessment methods? Have we talked to disability coordinators? Have we talked to other members of staff on quality? And then have we told the students that we've done this and that we have looked at their needs? Then the professional assessment requirements, which are another strand, which is about clarifying when reasonable accommodations can be made in areas where a student has to meet a professional board requirement. And Ireland colleagues have done a lot of work on this, on nursing, and we looked particularly at nursing and teaching. The location and the structure of the placements, additional practice time before performing a practical task, the extra time, the use of assistive technology. In these professional assessments, a lot of the requirements are about what time you've got to be there, how long you're going to be on the placement, and a lot of these things, for example, the night duty requirements, which are set by European law, actually can be adjusted a bit, because you don't have to do all the hours all in a long string. You can stretch it out, you can do it over a number of weeks, and a lot of assistive technology can be used on the wards. There are lots of issues about that. We've had staff saying, well, people can use their smartphones, but the patients will think they're phoning their friends. So, well, then you need to inform the patients that on the ward you may see some staff using smartphones, and that's because they're accessing necessary information. So there are a lot of concerns. Information for students, how you write your course handbook and your study guide, the very core of what you advertise when you're recruiting students, stating what the competence standards for the course are and how you're going to assess them, and the potential for the reasonable adjustments that might be available. Teaching and learning methods, so how you've gone through this process, the resources you have and facilities available. I had a wonderful example about oceanography in the south coast of the UK where they have an accessible boat. But not only do they have an accessible boat ship, I'm not sure of the terminology, where people with mobility issues, students with mobility issues can participate in all the weather requirements and data collection that they need to do. They also make sure that they work with the students on taking the modules that will make them employable at the end of the course on a land-based basis, because these students, although they are on the accessible boat, will not pass the health and safety regulations to work as an oceanographer at sea because of their impairment. And they just won't. There's no doubt about that. But if they've taken enough modules, they're making sure, the course team are making sure that they have the right modules for a land-based oceanography career, if that's what they want. So this is, a really interesting way of, this is a floating laboratory, basically, this boat. And the minimum standards for entry for professional registration. And again, evaluating, do we know the course handbook is any good? Do students give you any feedback? Do you ask? Did you like the course handbook? Did it answer your questions? Every year the same things churned out. Do we ask them? And then we get some evaluation back. Right. Delivering the reasonable accommodations where necessary. There will always be students with impairments who need the reasonable accommodations. We're not trying to wipe that away. We're trying to say, let's be clever about the way we design the courses, and then we can concentrate on those students. We know in the UK we have a number of students with very complex disabilities coming through the system now who do require a lot of support, both in the theory and the academic work and on their placements. Supporting the placement staff is very important. These placement staff are not usually members of the university. They are not aware of this universal design approach. They don't understand the equality law in the way the students might be treated, and they understandably have a lot of worries that they are going to be the person signing off that this person is competent along with the university. And there's a great need for staff training, continuous professional development, jargon, CPD, continuous professional development. And the question that I liked, which came from the Newcastle Medical School website, was about professional competence. What do the end users of the service, patients, parents, in the case of teachers, expect a graduate of the programme to be able to do? And that, I felt, really encapsulates where we're drawing the line on the competence standards. What do the end users expect the graduate to be able to do? And then you work with your student on that. And to make sure that where you are taking students' decisions with the student, you also involve the disability service and the placement provider. So if there's an issue about somebody failing a placement, it's not one person's job, or maybe as academics you might say, well, in the end it's mine, but you are conveying that and discussing that with the team. And similarly, where joint risk assessments are undertaken before placements, that everybody's involved, because there are often schools feel very anxious about who's doing the risk assessment and how they're involved. This is my last slide, I promise. So I've got in the pack that went out to AHEAD, there is a 1,000-word description of the research, because obviously I can only skate over it here. But our first real research finding is that we have to get this team approach working inside universities. And disability services role will change because they're going to need to bring their expertise into the academic environment. Competence standards should be clear and not confused with internal rules. Sometimes you may have rules about a placement, such as students must do one placement in the city and one placement in the countryside. That's not a competence standard. It's a very important, useful managerial rule, because otherwise all the students want to do the city placements and nobody wants to go out to the countryside. But as a placement advisor, you can make a reasonable accommodation to that for a student who, for fatigue reasons or other reasons related to their impairment, cannot undertake one or other of those placements. And that's where the issue about, is it a competence standard? Just a rule that makes us work really efficiently. Test each standard for direct relevance during the course design. Develop the modes of assessment, which was inclusive as possible. Ensure current and prospective students have a clear, accessible and timely information, detailing what the standards are they've got to meet, what the range of assessments might be. Those are the main ones that I put on this slide. There are rather a few more. But I do think that developing supporting procedures for staff and students when difficult decisions need to be made is quite important. There will always be a time when you face a really difficult problem with a student around whether they're meeting the competence standard. But you need to have already in place a system for dealing with that that you know is going to be fair, so that staff feel that there is a way that they're going to deal with it, and students don't feel that they've just been chucked out or picked on or whatever. So I think that's really important. And Pia said it's about human rights, and it is about human rights. This piece of research was based on the law, but it is really based about inclusive practice. Thank you. Did I make it? Last time I gave this presentation in Stockholm, it took an hour. So I'm sorry if I've missed anything.
No, thank you very much, Barbara. You will be here for tomorrow also?
I will be here tomorrow.
Yes, so it's possible to ask questions. Any questions now? Or comments? Yes, over here.
Thank you, Barbara. Very interesting. I'm Kathy from the University of Brighton. Just one question, really, because in my own work, my own PhD work, I looked at the inclusion within the workplace, within healthcare settings.
Yes.
And I just wonder whether you, when you were doing your study, were considering the fact that the educational agenda and the healthcare agenda, the NHS agenda, and the United Kingdom, whilst they have the same rhetoric in terms of the equality legislation and the need to be inclusive, they're very much influenced by very different and sometimes competing requirements, both from a policy but also from a fiscal perspective and an educational perspective. Did you consider that at all in any of your discussions?
We did talk around that subject, yes. We were informed that it's all Europe's fault. The legislation comes from Europe. But we did also, and I know they've done this in Ireland too, and you've probably been involved in that, when we really looked at the reasonable accommodations, there weren't, as with any other reasonable accommodations, there weren't all that many expensive ones, but they did require flexibility, and that does have an impact on staff time. And if you're going to have a placement that takes longer in a hospital, then the supervisor of that placement has got new students coming in and they've still got a student. So that you're right, there are issues about it isn't cost-free in some senses. But we also did find an awful lot of goodwill about, I mean, there are lots of examples in the guidelines. I've only shown you the bones. And we have written particular A4 pages on the examples we got on nursing teaching. What we got was an awful lot of very good ideas about how it could be done. So I agree that there are these issues, but we also got a huge amount of goodwill, people who just couldn't wait to tell us, that it could be done.
Yeah, I think I agree that there's often a goodwill, but I suppose what I'm particularly interested in is how do we tackle the culture of the workplace, really,
yes.
Which is still,
Yes.
based on my research, looking for the normal and able. And it doesn't seem to matter how much rhetoric we have about inclusion. whilst that predominates in the way people are considering their employers, their employees, and all the rest of it, it's a barrier we have to overcome. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yes, I mean, that was a real issue. That's why we made the particular point about the continuous professional development. This may be the first disabled student nurse who's gone on to a ward in a particular hospital. The placement supervisor may have feelings about that, including concerns about the sort of technology that might be coming with that student. And that's why we feel that the only way we can work against that culture, to change that culture, is for the training of the placement providers to happen before a student is even allocated. So the training is not related to that student. The training is related to the change that is happening in terms of reasonable accommodations and diversity in the workplace and those things. But yes, in medicine it's even more difficult because there are, 10 or 12 applications for every medical school placement. So there's inevitably, it's difficult for disabled students to get through that. However, equally try and make their demonstrating skills. And I wonder, would Tim be doing all he was doing if he was in the UK? He would have difficulty qualifying, I think, because to be a psychiatrist, you are a doctor. You have to qualify as a doctor first. Might just, but I'm very interested in the way his training went, because the issues you're raising are right.
I'm sorry we have to close up now, but it's really interesting issues to address. Thank you very much, Barbara Waters.